How did those meals black mothers made for under $1 in the 1960s keep families going? These meals were everyday acts of care, stretched from scraps and steady hands. What stories of sacrifice linger in dishes that carried so much on so little? Hot water cornbread was one of those meals that stretched a handful of cornmeal into something warm, crisp, and comforting. The kind of food black mothers in the 1960s relied on when every penny mattered. She would mix cornmeal with boiling water until it thickened into a soft dough, shaping each piece with quick, practiced motions. The skillet hissed the moment the patties hit the oil, the edges turning golden and crisp while the centers stayed tender. Hot water cornbread did not need anything fancy to make it satisfying. A little salt, a little heat, and the magic of turning almost nothing into something filling. Kids would grab pieces straight from the paper towel, blowing on their fingers while trying to sneak the first bite. It paired with beans, greens, soups, or stood on its own when there was not much else. This simple food carried families through long weeks and tight budgets, proving that a cheap meal could still hold pride, creativity, and love. Pinto beans and fatback simmered on the stove for hours, filling the house with a deep, smoky aroma that made even the leanest days feel softer. Pinto beans were one of the most affordable pantry items in the 1960s, and black mothers knew exactly how to stretch them into multiple meals. She would rinse the beans, pour them into a big pot, and drop in a small square of fatback to give everything flavor. The slow simmer turned the beans creamy, rich, and hearty, no matter how little meat was used. Sometimes she added onions or a bay leaf, sometimes nothing at all, but it always tasted like a real meal. When served over rice or with hot water cornbread, it fed the whole family for almost no money. Leftovers became tomorrow's lunch or tomorrow's dinner, depending on how long the pot lasted. Pinto beans were not just food. They were security, comfort, and proof that $1 could go further in the right hands. Neckbone stew was one of those dishes built from cuts that others overlooked, but black mothers knew exactly how to turn into something tender and rich. Pork neckbones were inexpensive in the 1960s, often sitting at the butcher counter waiting for families who needed meals that could last. She would rinse them clean, drop them into a heavy pot, and let them simmer with onions, carrots, potatoes, and whatever vegetables were available. The bones released flavor slowly, transforming the broth into something silky and savory. As the hours passed, the meat softened until it fell away easily, becoming the heart of the dish. Served over rice or alongside cornbread, neckbone stew warmed the body and stretched across multiple plates without ever feeling thin or spare. It tasted like patience, resilience, and wisdom in the kitchen. Black mothers used every scrap, every bone, and every dollar with intention, and neckbone stew was proof of what they could create. Fried cabbage with bacon drippings was a comfort dish that stretched a cheap vegetable into a full meal with just a spoonful of saved fat. Cabbage was inexpensive, filling, and easy to store, making it a regular visitor in 1960s kitchens. She would slice the head into ribbons, letting it fall into the hot skillet where bacon drippings popped and sizzled. The scent was enough to pull children from other rooms, the transformation from simple cabbage to rich, savory goodness happening right before their eyes. Sometimes she added onions or peppers, sometimes nothing but salt and a shake of pepper. The heat softened the cabbage until it wilted into silky layers, absorbing flavor that made it taste like far more than what it cost. Served over cornbread or next to a piece of fried bologna, it became a meal that felt complete without needing much else. Fried cabbage reminded families that even the humblest ingredients could taste like a blessing in the right hands. Hoecakes were quick, cheap, and beloved, the kind of fast skillet meal that kept families fed when the pantry was running low. These cornmeal pancakes came together in minutes, using nothing more than meal, water, a pinch of salt, and a little oil. She poured small circles of batter into a hot skillet, watching the edges bubble before flipping them with practiced ease. Hoecakes cooked fast, golden on the outside and tender inside, perfect for stacking on a plate with butter or syrup when it was available. They paired with eggs, beans, greens, or stood alone when money was tight. Kids loved them because they were warm, soft, and easy to eat, and mothers loved them because they stretched a few pennies into a filling meal. In 1960s, households where every ingredient mattered, hoecakes were a quiet hero of the weeknight table. Grits with butter or drippings was a breakfast foundation in many Black homes, a bowl of comfort that started the day with warmth even when the budget was thin. Grits were cheap, steady, and predictable, the kind of ingredient that never ran out too quickly, which made them a quiet lifeline during weeks when groceries had to stretch farther than anyone liked to admit. She cooked them slowly, stirring until they thickened into a creamy base, then added a pat of butter or a spoonful of saved drippings for flavor, watching the surface turn glossy as everything melted together. The steam rising from the bowl was enough to wake up sleepy children, and that first warm spoonful settled deep into the stomach like reassurance, a kind of calm that lingered even after the bowl was empty. Sometimes the bowl was plain, sometimes she added a sprinkle of salt, sometimes a little cheese if the week had been generous, and on rare mornings she drizzled syrup to make it feel like a treat. She served the grits in old bowls that had been passed down, bowls that clinked softly on the table and made the morning feel familiar before the day demanded anything difficult. No matter how simple they were, grits made the morning feel manageable, grounding everyone before school, farm work, house duties, or long shifts. In a world where days were long, money was tight, and work was demanding, that small bowl carried strength, comfort, and the steady reminder that even humble food could hold a family together. Red beans and rice was one of the most reliable meals of the 1960s, a dish that turned inexpensive ingredients into something filling enough for a large family. She would soak the beans overnight when she could, then simmer them for hours with onions, bell peppers, and a touch of seasoning. Even a small piece of sausage or ham bone could transform the whole pot, though the dish worked just as well without meat. As the beans cooked, they grew soft and creamy, blending with the rice in a way that made each bite feel comforting and complete. Red beans and rice lasted for days, reheated easily, and tasted better each time it was warmed on the stove. It was more than a meal. It was a strategy for survival, a lesson in making abundance from almost nothing. Fried bologna sandwiches were the childhood classic of the 1960s, a favorite in Black homes because they were cheap, quick, and endlessly satisfying. She would slice the bologna so it would not bubble in the pan, then fry it until the edges crisped and curled. The scent filled the kitchen instantly, warm and salty and familiar. Sometimes she placed it on plain white bread, sometimes toasted it, sometimes added mustard if there was any to spare. Kids loved hearing the sizzle, knowing that lunch was only minutes away. Fried bologna was reliable, even when money was not. It tasted like home, like comfort, like a little moment of joy on an otherwise tight budget day. Pig's feet stew was a true example of making the most of what was available, turning an inexpensive cut into a dish rich with flavor and tradition. Pig's feet were cheap in the 1960s, often considered scraps, but Black mothers knew how to simmer them into something tender and soulful. She boiled them slowly with onions, peppers, and spices, letting the broth thicken as the collagen melted into silky richness. The feet softened over time, releasing flavor that made the pot taste far more expensive than it was served with rice or cornbread. The stew stretched into multiple meals, feeding the family well past dinner. It was economical, nourishing, and rooted in history, carrying flavors passed through generations. Okra and tomatoes was a stovetop tradition built from garden produce, the kind of dish that cost almost nothing but tasted like everything good about home cooking. Okra grew easily in backyard gardens, and tomatoes were plentiful in warm months, making this a reliable meal during tight years when every penny mattered. She sliced the okra into rounds and stewed it gently with tomatoes, onions, and a little seasoning until everything melded into a soft, saucy mixture that clung to the spoon. Sometimes she added a spoonful of drippings for depth, sometimes nothing at all when the pantry was bare, trusting the vegetables to provide their own richness. The mixture simmered into a silky blend that was bright, tangy, and deeply comforting, full of the flavors that defined Southern kitchens. Eaten with rice, cornbread, or even alone from a bowl, it brought warmth to long days, and reminded everyone at the table how far a small garden could carry a family. It tasted like summer, like front porches, like careful tending and early morning watering. It tasted like love passed from one set of hands to the next, proof that simplicity did not mean lack. Meals like this were more than food. They were history, memory, and survival cooked slowly on the back burner. Stewed potatoes with onions were one of the most reliable meals a Black mother could turn to in the 1960s, built from ingredients that stayed good for weeks and cost almost nothing. She peeled the potatoes into rough chunks, sliced the onions thin, and dropped everything into a pot with a little salt, pepper, and whatever fat she had saved in a jar beside the stove. As the mixture simmered, the onions melted into sweetness, and the potatoes softened into a thick, comforting stew that coated the spoon and warmed the entire house with its aroma. Sometimes she added a splash of milk or a bit of broth when she had it, giving the pot an even creamier texture, but even without extras, the dish filled hungry stomachs with steady comfort. Served with cornbread, biscuits, or even a heel of leftover bread, this simple pot became a full supper, stretching one of the cheapest vegetables into something that tasted like home and stability during uncertain times. This was the kind of meal that soothed, that reassured, that proved a single pot could carry a family through an evening without fuss or strain. It was survival food with soul. Salmon croquettes made from canned salmon were a creative way to turn an inexpensive tin into a plate of golden, crispy patties that felt far richer than they were. She mixed the salmon with eggs, onions, seasonings, and just enough flour or cornmeal to bind everything together, shaping each patty with careful hands so they cooked evenly, never too thick or too thin. When the croquettes hit the hot skillet, they sizzled into crisp edges and soft centers, releasing a rich aroma that drifted through the kitchen and made every child wander closer to the stove with hopeful eyes. Sometimes she added a squeeze of lemon or a pinch of parsley when she wanted to make them feel extra special, even if the ingredients were simple and the budget was small. Served with rice, grits, sliced bread, or even plain crackers, they fed the whole family without straining the budget, and they tasted just as good hot or cold. Canned salmon might have been cheap, but in her hands it tasted like something far more special, a reminder that good cooking came from skill, not price, and that love could turn any pantry item into a memorable meal. These croquettes were proof that creativity and care could transform even the humblest ingredients into something warm, filling, and unforgettable. Navy bean soup was a dependable pot that stretched across days, especially when money was thin and every ingredient had to work hard. Navy beans were some of the cheapest dried beans available, and they puffed up beautifully during long simmering, turning the broth creamy without needing cream at all. She added ham hocks or leftover bones when she had them, letting the collagen and scraps of meat flavor the broth in slow waves that deepened as the hours passed. On leaner weeks, she seasoned the beans with onions, salt, and pepper alone, trusting the slow cooking to develop flavor through patience instead of cost. The soup thickened as it cooled, becoming even heartier the next day, and she often served it with cornbread or rice to stretch it further. The result was hearty, creamy, and nourishing, the kind of meal that kept children full from one evening to the next and taught everyone that comfort did not have to be expensive. Smothered pork chops with thinned gravy were a budget trick many Black mothers mastered, stretching one or two chops into a whole meal that tasted richer than it looked. She browned the chops first to build flavor, letting the sizzling meat leave behind dark bits that became the base of the gravy. Then she poured in water, onions, and seasonings to create a gravy that bubbled and thickened slowly, taking on the color and taste of the pan. The chops simmered until tender, but the real magic was the gravy poured over rice, potatoes, or bread, turning cheap staples into plates that felt complete. Children often cleaned their bowls with the last bites of bread just to catch every drop. Even when meat was scarce, everyone got a taste of its flavor through the sauce, making a small amount feel big enough to share and reminding the family that creativity mattered more than quantity. Fried mackerel, whether salted or canned, was a cheap way to serve fish in the 1960s, especially when fresh seafood was out of reach and families relied on pantry staples. She rinsed the mackerel to soften its strong flavor, dredged it lightly in flour, and fried it until crisp and golden, watching the skin curl and crisp as the heat worked its magic. The fish crackled in the skillet, sending its salty aroma through the house and waking up every appetite in the room. Sometimes she served it with sliced tomatoes or a spoon of greens on the side, creating a balanced meal that still cost almost nothing. Paired with grits or rice, it made a filling supper that stretched far, and its flavor was bold enough that even a small portion satisfied. Its taste was simple, familiar, and rooted in survival. The kind of food that came from necessity but still tasted like care and resilience. Cabbage rolls with rice filling were an inventive way to stretch vegetables into a full dinner, proving that creativity could turn humble ingredients into something comforting. She softened the cabbage leaves, wrapped them around seasoned rice, and added a little meat only when the budget allowed, sometimes using just a few spoonfuls to flavor the entire pot. The rolls simmered in tomato sauce until everything fused into tender, savory layers, absorbing the spices and broth until each bite tasted richer than the ingredients suggested. The smell of simmering cabbage filled the kitchen slowly, warming the space before the meal even reached the table. This dish fed many children at once, proving again how far rice could be stretched when paired with garden vegetables and reminding everyone that simple meals could still feel special. Sweet potato biscuits were soft, warm, and made from the sweet potatoes many families grew themselves, turning homegrown harvests into something filling and delicious. She mashed them into the dough, adding moisture, flavor, and natural sweetness, reducing the need for sugar or butter when money was tight. The color of the dough alone made the biscuits feel celebratory, a deep orange that looked cheerful before they even baked. When the biscuits rose in the oven, they filled the kitchen with a deep, earthy aroma that felt like comfort on a plate and reminded everyone of fall seasons and family gatherings, cheap to make and easy to stretch. They kept children full and happy, and they were perfect with syrup, gravy, or simply eaten warm from her hands. Collard greens with cornmeal dumplings were a resourceful twist on a classic pot of greens, using dumplings instead of extra meat to bulk up the meal and add texture. The greens simmered low and slow until tender, absorbing flavor from a small piece of salt pork if available, or from onions and seasonings when the budget was tighter. The broth turned rich and savory as it cooked, creating the perfect base for the dumplings. Then she dropped spoonfuls of cornmeal dough into the pot, letting them puff and soak up the seasoned broth until they swelled into soft, filling bites. The dumplings turned the pot into a hearty, satisfying supper that fed many people with minimal cost, reminding everyone at the table that simple cooking often made the most lasting memories. Rice and gravy suppers were a common weeknight solution in the 1960s, the kind of meal Black mothers turned to when they needed to feed several children quickly and cheaply. She made the gravy from drippings, onions, water, and seasonings, stirring carefully until the mixture thickened into a silky sauce that smelled far richer than its ingredients. Sometimes she added peppers or a spoon of tomato paste when she had extra, but the dish never required much to taste complete. Poured over hot rice, the dish tasted rich despite its simplicity, coating every grain in flavor. It was proof that flavor did not have to be expensive and that a good cook could make something comforting out of almost nothing, all while keeping bellies full and spirits steady. Cornmeal mush was a Depression-era holdover still relied on in the 1960s because it cost pennies to make. She boiled cornmeal with water until it thickened into a smooth porridge, serving it warm with syrup, butter, or drippings when available. Sometimes she chilled the leftovers, sliced them, and fried them the next day for a completely new meal that tasted crisp on the outside and soft on the inside. It was the kind of food that stretched through multiple meals without ever feeling wasteful, because she knew how to make every bite count. Mush was humble, hearty, and dependable, a true symbol of making something from almost nothing, and it taught every child at that table what resilience, resourcefulness, and steady hands in the kitchen could create. Butter beans with smoked sausage ends were the kind of dish Black mothers in the 1960s turned to when they needed something hearty, cheap, and reliable enough to stretch across an entire day. Butter beans were inexpensive and easy to find, and they swelled beautifully during long simmering, turning creamy and thick, even with the simplest seasoning. The real magic came from the sausage ends, those leftover pieces many butchers sold for almost nothing. She would rinse them, slice off any excess fat, and drop them straight into the pot, letting their smoky flavor spread through the beans until every spoonful tasted rich, even though the meat itself was minimal. On days when the budget was especially tight, she used fewer pieces, knowing the beans could still carry the flavor. The pot simmered for hours, filling the home with that unmistakable smell of beans, smoke, and slow cooking that always made children wander into the kitchen asking if dinner was ready yet. She seasoned it with salt, pepper, onions, and maybe a bay leaf if she had one tucked away in a drawer. When the beans finally softened into a velvety stew, she served them with cornbread or rice, creating a meal that stuck to the ribs and lasted long after the bowl was empty. It was survival food, but it was also comfort food, born from thrift but shaped by experience and love. Dishes like this proved that even scraps could build warmth at the table, one bowl at a time. Chicken backs and neck soup was a clever, resourceful meal many Black families depended on in the 1960s, especially when whole chickens were too expensive to buy regularly. The backs and necks were the least desired parts of the bird, often sold for pennies because so few people wanted them. But she knew they held flavor, and she knew how to coax every bit of it into a pot. She browned them first to deepen the base, then added onions, celery, and whatever vegetables she had, sometimes fresh from the garden, sometimes canned, sometimes left over from another meal entirely. As everything simmered, the broth turned golden and rich, flecked with tiny bits of meat that fell from the bones. She seasoned the pot with salt, pepper, garlic, and a pinch of whatever herbs were available, turning scraps into something that tasted much bigger than it was. When money was tight, she stretched the soup further with rice, noodles, or potatoes, transforming a handful of cheap ingredients into a pot that fed several people. Even the bones served a purpose, giving the broth body and depth long after the meat was gone. Children did not always understand how little went into the soup, but they always remembered how warm and full it made them feel. This was the kind of meal that reminded families of the power of patience, skill, and determination in the kitchen. Nothing was wasted, not even the parts others threw away. Canned sardines with crackers were a simple but filling meal Black mothers relied on in the 1960s, especially for quick lunches when the budget was strained. Canned sardines were inexpensive, rich in protein, and easy to store, making them a dependable pantry staple. She would open the tin carefully, letting the oil or mustard sauce spill just a little before lifting each piece out with a fork. Sometimes she mashed the sardines with onions, peppers, or a splash of hot sauce to stretch the flavor even further. Other times, she served them straight from the tin with saltine crackers lined neatly on a plate, turning something humble into something satisfying. Children would stack the crackers into tiny sandwiches, laughing at how messy it could get while she watched with patient eyes. Adults appreciated the bold taste, the convenience, and the way sardines could fill a stomach for almost no cost. On days when she had tomatoes from the garden or leftover greens from the night before, she added them to the plate, transforming the lunch into a full meal without spending more money. It was food born from necessity, but remembered for its comfort and familiarity. Even today, many people still recall the sound of the tin opening, the smell of the seasoned fish, and the simplicity of a lunch that required almost nothing but delivered exactly what the family needed. Souse meat with hot sauce was a cold, tangy, gelatinous dish that many Black mothers in the 1960s served because it was cheap, filling, and made entirely from leftover pork trimmings that butchers practically gave away. She would boil the scraps slowly, letting the fat and collagen break down until the pot filled with a savory broth that thickened naturally as it cooled. Vinegar, onions, peppers, and seasonings were added to give it that sharp flavor souse meat was known for. Once everything softened, she poured it into a pan and let it chill in the icebox until it firmed into something sliceable. It was not fancy, but it was full of flavor, and paired with hot sauce, it became a meal that woke up the senses. Some days she served it with crackers, other days with cornbread or sliced potatoes, depending on what she had. It fed many people with little effort and even less money, and it kept well, making it a reliable leftover dish. Children sometimes hesitated at its appearance, but the adults appreciated its history, its depth, and the way it honored the tradition of using every part of the animal. Souse meat was proof that thrift did not have to mean tastelessness. It was survival food shaped by culture, creativity, and the understanding that nothing edible should ever go to waste. Macaroni and tomatoes was one of the simplest meals Black families relied on in the 1960s, but simplicity never stopped it from being comforting, filling, and deeply familiar. She would boil elbow macaroni until tender, drain it, and then stir in stewed tomatoes or canned tomato sauce seasoned with salt, pepper, and just a touch of sugar to balance the acidity. Sometimes she added onions or a spoonful of bacon drippings if she had them, giving the dish a richer flavor without inflating the cost. The pot came together quickly, making it perfect for busy days or late nights when hunger hit fast and money was low. Children loved its soft texture and bright color, and she loved how easily it fed everyone without stretching the budget too thin. It could be eaten alone or paired with greens, cornbread, or leftover meat from earlier in the week. Every bite tasted like comfort, like something familiar that had been passed down because it worked. It was the kind of dish you could make with your eyes closed, the kind that lived in memory long after times got easier. Macaroni and tomatoes represented resourcefulness, patience, and the belief that food did not need to be expensive to be meaningful. Beans and hoecake stretch meals were a staple in many Black households during the 1960s, a perfect example of how a single pot of beans could feed an entire family when paired with large skillet-fried hoecakes. She simmered the beans slowly, adding onions, salt, pepper, and whatever seasoning she could afford, sometimes with a small piece of pork if it was available. The beans grew richer the longer they cooked, becoming thick and hearty enough to stand on their own. But the real magic came from the hoecakes, big enough to hold in two hands, golden from the skillet, and crisp on the edges while soft in the middle. They stretched the meal further than plain cornbread because they were larger, filling, and easy to make in bulk. Children used them to scoop the beans, soaking up the broth until nothing was left in the bowl. Families relied on meals like this because they were cheap, dependable, and comforting, reminding everyone that even simple food could feel special when made with care. Cornbread and buttermilk in a cup was a tradition many Black families in the 1960s grew up with, especially in rural areas where food had to stretch as far as possible. She crumbled leftover cornbread into a cup, poured cold buttermilk over the top, and stirred until it formed a tangy, filling mixture that worked as a snack, a breakfast, or even a light dinner when money was tight. The texture was soft and cool, the kind of food that felt nourishing even though it cost almost nothing. Some children added a little sugar to sweeten it, while adults often preferred it plain, enjoying the sharpness of the buttermilk. It was not fancy, but it was dependable, made from ingredients always on hand. Cornbread and buttermilk fed generations, connecting families to traditions older than anyone could remember. Chitterlings with potatoes were a labor-intensive but inexpensive meal many Black mothers prepared because chitterlings, or pork intestines, were one of the cheapest cuts available. Cleaning them took hours, a process she approached with patience, determination, and experience. Once cleaned, she simmered them with onions, peppers, and seasonings until they softened into something tender and flavorful. Potatoes stretched the pot further, absorbing the broth and giving the meal more substance without adding cost. The smell was strong, but so was the flavor, and families gathered around steaming bowls knowing how much effort had gone into every bite. Chitterlings were not just food. They were survival, culture, and resilience simmered in a single pot. Molasses bread, often called brown bread, was a sweet, dense loaf made from inexpensive pantry ingredients Black mothers relied on in the 1960s. Flour, baking powder, molasses, and a little fat were all she needed to create a bread that rose dark and fragrant in the oven. The molasses gave it a deep, rich flavor that felt indulgent even when money was tight. Sliced warm with butter or eaten plain, it filled stomachs quickly and paired well with beans, soups, or even morning coffee. The bread kept well, stayed moist for days, and cost only pennies to make. It was a reminder that sweetness did not have to come from expensive desserts. Sometimes it came from a loaf born out of thrift, memory, and steady hands in the kitchen. Smothered cabbage and sausage was the art of stretching a single link of sausage to feed a whole family. A pot of cabbage might not sound like much, but when it hit a skillet with onions, garlic, and just one piece of sausage, it became a feast. The fat from that small bit of meat seasoned everything, coating the wilted greens with a smoky flavor that felt like more than it was. The sizzle of cabbage cooking was music in many 1960s kitchens, a reminder that flavor comes from creativity, not cost. Some added a splash of vinegar for bite, others a sprinkle of sugar to balance the salt. Whatever the method, the result was the same: a steaming plate that filled you up and comforted you through lean times. Smothered cabbage and sausage was a dish built on faith that love could multiply what little there was. Homemade Chow relish added brightness and crunch to plates crowded with greens, beans, and smoked meats. Cabbage, onions, peppers, and green tomatoes were chopped fine and simmered with vinegar, mustard seed, and sugar until they formed a tangy condiment that could last through winter. Every household had a slightly different recipe, some sweeter, some hotter, each a reflection of the cook's own hand. The relish brought sharp contrast to rich dishes like pork shoulder or pinto beans, cutting through heaviness with a lively bite. In late summer, neighbors gathered to chop vegetables together, sharing stories as big pots bubbled on outdoor fires. Jars lined pantry shelves in rows of glowing gold and green, a promise of flavor when fresh produce was long gone. Over time, store-bought pickles and bottled sauces replaced the careful preparation of chow, but its memory endures wherever families recall the sound of knives on wooden boards and the reward of a bright spoonful alongside a hearty meal. Shepherd's pie with mashed sweet potatoes was a clever twist on an old classic that fit the budget of Black families in the 1960s. Instead of pricey white potatoes, sweet potatoes from the garden were boiled, mashed, and spread on top of a filling made from scraps of meat and vegetables. My grandmother would use whatever was left, bits of beef, chicken, or even pork, chopped small and cooked with onions, carrots, or peas until it formed a savory base. The sweet potato topping baked into a golden layer that balanced the salty meat with a touch of natural sweetness. It was hearty enough to fill everyone, but cheap enough to make even during lean weeks. Sweet potatoes were plentiful in many southern gardens, and they stretched farther than most vegetables because they were filling and rich in flavor. Shepherd's pie with mashed sweet potatoes was more than just food. It was a statement of ingenuity. Families made do with what they had and still put something warm and comforting on the table. That golden crust represented thrift and care, carrying both survival and love in every spoonful. Sweet corn pudding was the kind of side dish that made every plate feel special. It came out of the oven golden and trembling, soft like a custard and rich with the taste of summer corn. Grandparents made it when the fields were full and nothing went to waste. Fresh kernels were scraped straight off the cob, mixed with milk, butter, and eggs, then baked until the top browned just right. The smell filled the kitchen with a warmth that promised comfort. It was sweet, but not too sweet, the perfect partner for fried chicken or greens. Every spoonful melted on your tongue, reminding you that good food didn't need much, just care, patience, and a steady hand stirring the bowl. For families who grew their own crops, this dish was pride baked into every bite, a celebration of harvest and home. It carried a kind of nostalgia that tasted like Sunday dinner at Grandma's table. Black walnut pound cake carried the wild woods straight into the holiday kitchen with a perfume unlike any other. Foragers collected the hard-shelled nuts each autumn, cracking them carefully to release the dark, robust kernels inside. The cake batter, rich with butter and eggs, absorbed the strong, earthy flavor of the walnuts, baking into a loaf dense enough to slice thin and savor slowly. Served at Christmas or family reunions, the cake announced both celebration and the success of gathering nature's bounty. Children helped shell the nuts, their hands stained brown from the husks, a seasonal badge of honor. Neighbors traded slices wrapped in wax paper as gifts, spreading cheer through the community. Today, imported walnuts and commercial cakes have replaced the ritual, but the memory of that deep, almost smoky taste lingers for those who once enjoyed a slice with coffee while snow fell outside and the house smelled of spice and toasting nuts. Mustard greens with salt pork were the kind of dish that spoke to both thrift and tradition. Collard greens were loved, but when money was tight, mustard greens filled the pot just as well, with a sharper bite and a quicker cook. My grandmother simmered them slowly with scraps of salt pork, the fat melting into the broth until every leaf carried flavor. The kitchen smelled earthy, smoky, and strong, reminding everyone that even the humblest greens could feel like a feast when seasoned with care. She always said the broth, what some called potlikker, was the best part, soaking it up with cornbread to make sure not a drop was wasted. It was a dish that brought families together around the table, passing bowls and breaking bread even when meat was scarce. Salt pork was cheap because it was mostly fat, but it gave depth to every bite, transforming greens into comfort. In the 1960s, this was not just a side, it was supper, filling bellies after long days of work. Mustard greens with salt pork carried heritage, thrift, and resilience in one simmering pot. String beans and potatoes were proof that vegetables could be comfort food. The beans simmered low and slow in a pot with onions, black pepper, and leftover drippings from breakfast bacon. The potatoes softened just enough to soak up all that smoky flavor, turning a simple pot into something you could build a meal around. It was a dish that made use of what the land and the pantry offered, nothing more. Grandparents knew exactly how long to let it cook, long enough for the beans to fall apart, but not lose their soul. The smell filled every room, humble but heartwarming. Served with cornbread or rice, it felt like a small feast even on hard days. This wasn't fine dining, it was family dining, the kind that left you full and thankful. Fried cornmeal mush turned yesterday's breakfast into today's dinner with nothing more than heat and ingenuity. It started as cornmeal porridge, cooked thick and poured into a pan to cool overnight. By the next day, it was firm enough to slice and fry in a skillet until golden brown at the edges and creamy inside. Black mothers made it for their children before school or served it with syrup for supper when money was tight. It cost almost nothing, just cornmeal, water, and a pinch of salt, but it tasted like plenty. The sizzling sound as the slices hit the pan was pure comfort, a sign that food was on the table and love was in the room. Fried cornmeal mush was the definition of resourcefulness. Nothing wasted, everything transformed. In homes where every dollar mattered, it wasn't just breakfast, it was pride reborn from leftovers. Stewed oxtails with rice gravy brought deep flavor and slow-cooked richness to Sunday tables across many African American communities. Oxtails, once inexpensive and overlooked, were browned in heavy pots and then simmered for hours with onions, garlic, and spices until the meat turned buttery soft. The braising liquid thickened into a silky gravy that clung to each grain of rice, creating a dish that was equal parts comfort and celebration. Families saved this meal for weekends when everyone could gather because patience was essential and conversation flowed while the pot worked its magic. Children sneaked tastes from wooden spoons, drawn by the savory aroma that filled the house from morning until evening. The humble tale, once discarded by butchers, became a centerpiece of pride and ingenuity. Today, rising prices and faster cooking habits mean fewer people take the time to coax such tenderness from a simple cut of beef, but those who remember the meal speak of it as a perfect union of thrift, skill, and the slow rhythm of family life. Cornmeal dumplings in tomato broth were the type of dish that felt simple but filling, carrying both thrift and comfort in every bowl. The broth began with canned or fresh tomatoes, cooked down with onions, garlic, and a touch of seasoning to build a savory base. My grandmother mixed cornmeal with a bit of flour, salt, and water to form small dumplings, dropping them carefully into the bubbling pot. As they simmered, the dumplings softened into tender bites, soaking up the tang of the tomatoes while thickening the stew. The smell alone brought everyone to the kitchen, the blend of corn and tomato promising something hearty without needing meat. Cornmeal was cheap and always on hand, a staple in Black households across the South. Tomato broth was inexpensive too, whether from garden harvests or canned goods bought in bulk. Together, they created a meal that cost next to nothing but filled hungry stomachs with warmth. Cornmeal dumplings in tomato broth turned two of the humblest ingredients into a family staple, proving that frugality and care could produce meals worth remembering. Black-eyed pea salad was the cool breeze of the dinner table. It started as a way to use up leftovers from the pot of peas cooked the night before, but it became its own tradition. The peas were chilled, mixed with onions, bell peppers, and a drizzle of vinegar, then left to marinate until every bite had a kick. It was light but filling, tangy but balanced, and always refreshing on hot summer days. Grandparents made it for picnics, church gatherings, or just to stretch food a little farther. Every spoonful was bright, flavorful, and full of texture. It reminded people that nothing needed to be wasted when creativity led the kitchen. That's how survival became flavor and thrift became art. It was more than a side. It was a lesson in making something beautiful from what you already had. Served cold from an enamel bowl or mason jar, it brought a spark of freshness to plates filled with rich meats and cornbread. The vinegar's bite cut through the heat, and the crisp vegetables gave it life. Kids didn't always understand how simple it was, they just knew it tasted good. But for the older hands who made it, it was about pride, discipline, and the joy of making abundance out of what others overlooked. Neckbone stew was the kind of meal that turned scarcity into comfort. Cheap cuts of pork neck, barely worth a few cents a pound, became a family feast when simmered low and slow. Black mothers in the 1960s knew that time, patience, and seasoning could make even the humblest ingredients taste like love. The pot would bubble for hours, filling the kitchen with the deep scent of onion, garlic, and pepper. Potatoes softened into the broth, thickening it until it clung to the spoon. The meat, once tough and overlooked, fell from the bone like silk. This was Sunday dinner on a shoestring, a dish that asked for little and gave everything. It brought families together after long weeks of work, a reward for endurance and care. Nothing about it was fancy, but every bite spoke of home and heart. A bowl of neckbone stew was proof that flavor lives in the hands, not the wallet. It reminded everyone that with love and skill, you could make plenty from almost nothing. Okra fritters, also known as okra cakes, offered crisp golden edges and a tender interior that celebrated the summer garden. Fresh okra pods were chopped fine, mixed with cornmeal, onions, and a dash of pepper, then spooned into hot oil until each patty puffed and browned. Sold at fish fries, church picnics, and traveling fairs, these fritters were easy to eat by hand and full of flavor that tied African heritage to southern soil. The okra gave a subtle sweetness and a soft binding that kept the patties moist while the cornmeal crust provided satisfying crunch. Children waited impatiently beside bubbling skillets, hoping for the first fritter to cool enough to taste. Vendors wrapped them in newspaper cones so families could stroll through evening air scented with music and spice. Modern snack foods have replaced these handcrafted treats, but those who remember the sound of oil popping and the taste of garden-fresh okra know the fritters carried more than flavor. They held the joy of gathering and the pride of turning humble crops into a festival of taste. Sorghum syrup biscuits with milk were the kind of dinner that showed how families found sweetness even in struggle. Sorghum syrup, cheaper than sugar, was kept in jars that seemed to last forever, poured generously over hot biscuits fresh from the oven. My grandmother baked the biscuits with flour and lard, ingredients that could be stretched and shared across multiple meals. Once the biscuits were ready, she split them open, drizzled them with syrup, and served them with cold milk poured into glasses. It was simple but filling, providing enough energy for tired workers and growing children. The sweetness of the syrup turned plain flour biscuits into something that felt like a treat, even if it was just supper. In the 1960s, this kind of meal reminded families that comfort did not always need meat or elaborate dishes. It was about making do with what was on hand and finding joy in it. Sorghum syrup biscuits with milk were a reminder that sweetness could soften the edge of hardship. Turnip greens with salt pork had a depth of flavor only time and care could create. The greens simmered slowly until tender, flavored by chunks of salt pork that gave off a richness no seasoning could match. Grandparents made them in big pots, stirring occasionally, tasting often, and trusting their instincts. The broth that gathered at the bottom, the potlikker, was gold. It was sopped up with cornbread, never wasted, because that's where all the goodness lived. This dish told a story of endurance, of families who turned scarcity into flavor and routine into ritual. Every pot was a reminder of resilience passed down generation by generation. Even now, a forkful of those greens tastes like history, salty, smoky, soulful, and true. If any of these under $1 meals reminded you of someone's kitchen, share your memory in the comments and tap like and subscribe so more stories like yours can rise back to the surface.